In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about one of the most important of the stories when it comes to the biblical interpretations of Christianity, as well as one of the New Testament stories that really are so incredibly important when it comes to Christian beliefs in both Jesus and in God. So this is the theological concepts and the theological conceptions around the resurrection of Christ, and the idea that that Jesus Christ is God incarnate, that meaning that he is God in human form, as well as the ascension to heaven. So these are all different concepts that really do tie together and almost also tie into other belief systems relating to the concept of the Trinity and the concept of the nature of God as well. So we can really cover these all under the single story, which is the resurrection, or the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But it also ties into that things relating to the concept of God, of Christ as God incarnate, as well as the ascension of Christ to heaven. So, as an introduction, there are three main ideas in Christian theology that are intimately linked together. These are the concept that Jesus is God incarnate, that Jesus is God in human form, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as well as the ascension of Christ to heaven. These are the three major beliefs when it comes to Christian beliefs in Jesus and Christian beliefs in the nature of Jesus and the teachings and understanding of Jesus, as well as a lot of beliefs relating to the concept of sin. If you remember, and you may know, as somebody who may be Christian, or someone who may have gone through a certain amount of Christian teaching already, that Jesus was crucified on the cross and was resurrected and ascended to heaven. All of these different beliefs to die for the sins of man, and so we see that there's a lot of intimate connection here between all of these ideas, as well as the idea of the relationship between man and God. So all of these things are very important. The incarnation, the concept of incarnation. In the first lesson that we did on Jesus, we noted that Christians believe that Jesus is God incarnate, that Jesus is God in human form. And according to this principle, Jesus is not subject to the same disadvantage of original sin as all the rest of humanity. So we can then make an even closer link between the original sin that every single human is born with and the original sin that was first committed by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, all the way back in the book of Genesis. The belief is that since the book of Genesis and since the fall of Adam and Eve, the fall out of favor with God and fall out of the perfect relationship with God, we see that all humans are born with original sin. Jesus, though, is not necessarily somebody who is born with original sin in the same kind of way, because Jesus is a part of the Holy Trinity. He is part of the Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He is also part of God. He is God in human form. So he cannot be disadvantaged in the same way with original sin as all normal human beings, considering that God is all good and is all loving. He cannot inherently, it would be contradictory for him to live in sin. So as a result of this, Jesus is the incarnation of God and came to earth for this explicit purpose to die for the sins of mankind. And this is really what links the idea of the incarnation with the idea of resurrection, the idea that Jesus is God incarnate, and the idea that Jesus will resurrect and become and ascend up to heaven and die for the sins of mankind. All of these things link together quite nicely and neatly when it comes to biblical interpretation. The crucifixion of Christ is a well-documented event that takes place, and there are even historians that suggest that it may have actually happened. So this is really where we start to see a link between not just the theological interpretation of Christ, but also the historical interpretation of Christ, the historical Jesus. And the way in which we understand the historical Jesus is that we have a general understanding or a general idea that the crucifixion may have actually happened, or something may have happened. It seems like, on account of all the historical texts that we see and the sources of in and around that time, that something like this may have happened. And the death of Jesus is said to have occurred when he was crucified. It's an old method of execution that's utilized in many areas of society, but mostly and most importantly for the purposes of the resurrection and the ascension to heaven, it was used by the Romans during the Roman Empire. And so therefore, the crucifixion is a method of execution. It's a very torturous method of execution. It's apparently very, very painful, according to people who study these kind of executions, not people who have been through it, of course. But generally speaking, this is not a pleasant way of going out. And the idea that Jesus was crucified is the reason that the cross is a sign of and a major symbol of the Christian religion. The cross is probably the most major of the Christian religious symbols. And so therefore, the reason for this is because of the crucifixion, because he dies on the cross. So the ways in which we go from the sort of historical interpretation, which is about as much as we have here, and we go from that to the theological interpretation and the ways in which we understand and link the concept of miracles with the resurrection and the crucifixion, is the idea that Jesus did not remain dead for very, very long. Christians believe that Jesus was resurrected 3 days after his own crucifixion, and this is probably the ultimate miracle, because it shows power over death, and it shows power over death in a way that really solidifies the Christian belief that Jesus is God incarnate. And it also, as I've said here, it proves that Jesus was indeed God incarnate, and it links these ideas with the Holy Trinity. The next of these events that takes place is the ascension to heaven. So the final idea is his ascension to heaven. In the book of Acts, it is said that Jesus returned to heaven after his resurrection. He met with his disciples, one of which, Thomas, was somebody who did not believe that it was actually Jesus, and was somebody who had to actually touch the holes in his wrists, or the holes in his hands where the nails had gone in when it came to the crucifixion, to finally believe that this was actually Jesus' resurrection. Now, interpretations of the ascension itself differ quite widely when it comes to the different views of Christianity. So, in some instances, Christians will take the idea of the ascension very, very literally. They will take the belief that Jesus literally rose back and ascended back to heaven, and that is to be the literal interpretation. However, just like with a number of other biblical passages, other Christians will take a more symbolic understanding of the ascension, suggesting that rather than ascending to heaven, he is ascended in a more spiritual way, in a way that maybe something that is a little bit more realistic in terms of the ways in which we can reconcile our beliefs in logic and reason and science and understanding with the kind of miracles that we are describing in the Bible. A lot of the challenges to the Christian doctrine and to any other religious doctrine is the idea of miracles and the idea that they are essentially impossible to perform. And so for some Christians who take a more liberal interpretation of the Bible, they may not understand the miracle stories that we have of Jesus as being something that ought to be taken literally, but that they are more like parables. They really explain moral messages and have moral significance. And maybe, according to some Christians, the ascension is described in a similar way. The ascension to heaven is not necessarily something that ought to be taken literally, but is really something that ought to be taken symbolically, as to have deeper meaning beyond the literal moving up to heaven.